Chancellor Henry R. Gibson from Tennessee doesn't waste a word. There isn't a sentence in this one paragraph you can explain in less than a minute. We're going to read one paragraph together, and I'm going to have to stop on every sentence so you get the idea that when these chancellors talk, you can't miss a word. You've got to read it 5 times because they are not making a grammatical or word choice mistake. It's absolutely spot on. Here's what I'm getting at. I've already read the long version of Subrogation and redline them. Sheldon's book, Mitchell's book, the guy with P over his name. It brings me back to the one paragraph in Gibson. I was so blown away by what I read in 2 sentences, I read another 1,500 pages to realize it's all in one paragraph. It's called subrogation. What is subrogation in general? Have you ever read suretyship? I'm going to test your ability to unlearn what you think you know and relearn what you need to know. That's tough. What you have to unlearn is that all transactions are a buyer and a creditor paradigm. It's wrong. The devil's trick. There are 3 parties to every transaction: debtor, creditor, and a surety. How do you know you're the surety? Did you sign it? Did you make the payment? You've become always the surety, but not always the debtor. That's the devil's trick. Most of the time, you are not the debtor at all. We wind up being a volunteer surety. Can we get a remedy if we pay? That depends. Did you volunteer? Were you under necessity and without recourse? If you don't pay, what happens to you? Nothing. Then bingo, yes, you were a surety. Now, if it's your daughter and you collateralize her loan and signed anywhere, and then when she doesn't pay it, it damages you, your property estate in some way, then now you are a real true surety and not a volunteer. The devil is the expert in getting us to be volunteer sureties. We thought we were the name on the birth certificate. That birth certificate is the state. It's never been us. There are the debtors, solvent or insolvent. I won't venture to guess. I'd rather them say which. If it is solvent or insolvent, see, the solvency of the principal need not be shown beyond a reasonable doubt, but will be determined, like all other facts, by the preponderance of probabilities. See Annotated Code subsection 445 and Thompson's versus Watson. This is why one of the first things we do in the declaration of status is the release any further obligations to be a volunteer surety for that trust estate name. So the remedy as a surety is a glorious thing. If this doesn't show you what Jesus did on the cross, then nothing will. This is the ultimate proof that something very significant outside of Roman civil law that only the inherent equity can see. Page 484 in Gibson's Suits in Chancery, section 962. Suretyship, subrogation, substitution, exoneration. Well, we will review the letter to read in Judge's Chambers, where you'll see the subrogation is mixed into the letter to see the real application, and you'll see that what's going on here. Subsection 962 in Henry R. Gibson Suits in Chancery, suits for exoneration of sureties. Entire good faith is required between debtor and creditor and sureties, and if a creditor does any act affecting the surety, or if he omits to do any act of duty which he is required to do by the surety, or otherwise bound to do, and that act or omission may prove injurious to the surety, or if a creditor enters into a stipulation with the debtor unknown to the surety and inconsistent with the terms of the original contract, the surety may set up such act, omission, or stipulation as a defense to any suit brought against him in a court of law or equity, so that if a creditor stipulates with his debtor in a binding manner upon a sufficient consideration to give further time for payment without the consent of the surety, the latter, the surety, will be thereby discharged, if the arrangement might be injurious to him. Mere delay on the part of the creditor, at least if some other equity does not intervene, unaccompanied with any valid contract for such delay, will not amount to laches, so as to discharge the surety. No matter how much time passes without a lawsuit, you are still the surety, for the creditor is under no obligation to press the principal for payment. Two principal debtors. One is the COLB birth certificate. The other is the Social Security number. The Social Security card actually said in plain English, that it is not your Social Security card. The COLB, the Certificate of Live Birth or Birth Certificate, says the state owns it. These are the principles. So when filling out an SS5 FS form, an SS5 foreign status form, and you are to put in your information, the state is actually using the two separate entities of your COLB-BC linked to the Social Security number or Social Security card, but the Social Security card relies on the suretyship of the COLB, Certificate of Live Birth or Birth Certificate. These two are connected because you put the information down on the SS5 FS, Foreign Status Form. Generally, when it comes out to you, it matches the all caps matching the COLB and birth certificate, the Certificate of Live Birth and Birth Certificate. You volunteered surety for both. However, sureties are not obliged to wait for their principal to bring suit, but are entitled to come into a court of equity after a debt has become due and compel the debtor to exonerate them from their liability by paying the debt. Read that again. Sureties are not obliged to wait for their principals to bring suit, but are entitled to come into a court of equity after a debt has become due to compel the debtor to exonerate them from their liability by paying the debt. Where do you usually see the word exonerate? In law, criminal law, right? What's happening is they are using the word exonerate because they're discharged as the surety for the charges under the crime. Did you see Bill Cosby's indictment? It said William Cosby. Then underneath it says Cosby, William, surety. And the moment you see surety, your alarm bells should be going off. I'll just extrapolate when I read this. A private American national acting as surety is not obliged to wait for for the birth certificate or Social Security account holder to suit, and the surety is entitled to equity that any time a payment of a debt has become due to compel the principal, birth certificate, Social Security to pay the debt. And if they do not pay the debt, the surety is exonerated from payment thereto. In other words, hey, principal, I order you to pay that. If you don't, I'll be exonerated. What is the remedy? You demand the principal debtor to pay the debt. For if they refuse or fail to pay, you are exonerated as surety. Third time's the charm. Third time's the charm. Sureties are not obliged to wait for their principal to bring suit, but are entitled to come into a court of equity after a debt has become due and compel the debtor to exonerate them from their liability by paying the debt. So, when I add what I put in parentheses regarding due process to the treasurer of the birth county, if a surety requests the creditor to sue forthwith, stating that he will consider himself no longer bound as surety if the creditor fails to do so, he will be discharged by the creditor's failure to sue. If his principal was solvent when the notice was given, but becomes insolvent after the expiration of the time probably required to prosecute the suit to judgment if it had been promptly instituted as requested. You are demanding the creditor, hold on a second. You are demanding the creditor sue the debtor, or you'll be exonerated. So who's the creditor in the criminal case? The United States of America? Question mark. The United States? Question mark. Send the demand to the USA to sue the birth certificate for those charges. I'll give you 30 days to do so. If you don't sue the COLB, the certificate of live birth, the birth certificate, the social security number, driver's license number, and any and all other derivative sureties, and if you fail to do so, you thereby exonerate this man for fair, just, equal, and righteous cause. That's theirs. See how you are recognizing that the debtor is the principal and not you. You are claiming yourself just the son, heir, as master of all things, even over the surety, as you are being compelled to be liable if the debtor doesn't pay. That debtor is the independent entity you don't own. That's theirs. The devil's got you in a volunteer suretyship contract. Some claim that it's not voluntary. Here's why. Subsection 963, frame and forms of bills for exoneration of sureties. The bill must allege 1, the fact of suretyship and how arising, and 2, the solvency of the principal debtor when the right of action on the obligation occurred, and 3, that after such right occurred and while the principal was solvent, complainant notified the creditor to bring suit at once on said obligation, or he, the complainant, would stand as surety no longer. And 4, that after such notice, the creditor failed to sue in a reasonable time. 5, that in the interim between such notice and the bringing of suit by said creditor against complainant on said obligation, the principal debtor became insolvent. And 6, should pray that said creditor's suit be enjoined and complainant discharged from the liability on said obligation. Number 4 above, or would be no longer liable or responsible, or would consider himself discharged, released, or some equivalent expression. Subsection 964, Bill of Exoneration of Surety, page 756 for address, caption, see annotated code, subsection 155 through 164 and 789. Regarding 964, the actual remedy of our Lord coming to bat for you, watch how this works to relieve you. Subrogation is the substitution of one person in the place of a creditor whose debt he has paid under compulsion. Did he say because it's a nice day out and you were feeling charitably generous to just do it anyway? No, he said you have got to be under compulsion. Sheriff's example about to evict the man named Juan Valdez. Anyone want to go save Juan Valdez? Anyone have any ties compelled to go save him? Are you renting a room in his house? So if he gets kicked out, you may become liable. Now you are under compulsion to do something. Get it? Question raised. Why shouldn't we be interested? Because the rules of equity, the rules of the true sovereign, Yahweh, say equity does not come to the aid of a volunteer, surety. That's the devil's trick. Now, if you want to go over to save Juan Valdez, you can strike a deal with Juan charitably, but now equity sees your charitable act and calls it a volunteer charitable act, a gift you gifted to Juan Valdez. And equity does not come to the aid, the imperfect gift, perfection of an imperfect gift. As a volunteer, you are in legal land. Did Juan agree to pay you back or give you capitals from his apple tree? Is there any implicit agreement, or did you give charity because you are a good-natured person? You don't get equity from being charitable, but you are more than welcome to be charitable. Now, a lady in Dade County, Florida, sent a beautiful pleading to the county tax assessor that they have perfected title in the land and require true full accounting on the land patent from the beginning, and the tax assessor had the character to call her up and say, okay, we received your letter. And we do recognize your full accounting back on the land patent. 2 weeks later, the county tax assessor called back and says, I made a mistake. All the payments on that land for the last 60 years have all been voluntary under no compulsion to do so. If it's no compulsion to do so, it's voluntary. If it's under compulsion to do so, doesn't mean contract. It just means compulsion. The rest of us aren't. Volunteering doesn't stop you from being charitable. It does stop you from getting subrogation remedy. Marco raised the question over who gets the $2,200. Neighbor's house next door is on fire. He's not home. You're under compulsion to put the fire out because your house is liable to burn down. So the fire department shows and says, no, we are sorry. We can't because he didn't pay property taxes. He owes $2,200. We can only put out the fire for those who pay property taxes. Start pumping water. Boom. You pay it under compulsion. I'll be right back with that check. Now, insurance shows up to pay for the house that burned down. Who gets the money? You do, because you subrogate as surety, security. Because you paid under compulsion. We may be limited to what you paid, but we'll find out what you are entitled to. You definitely take priority over the creditor, over that mortgage company, over the beneficiary on the insurance policy if acting under compulsion. The one compulsed to do so subrogates the rights of the creditor. You subrogate to the creditor. The creditor is subrogated to you. The creditor takes a back seat. You have substituted for the creditor. Never call yourself a creditor substituting in. You are not the creditor ever. You are a subrogee. They are the subrogor. You only say you are the subrogee. I am under compulsion in this matter. I made a payment under compulsion, not being liable primarily, therefore, into whose rights as to the collection of the debt he thereupon succeeds. As the merger, it's merger because you thought you were the debtor, yet you are the subrogee, and the subrogee has superior priority rights over all parties. Back to the COLB and birth certificate. Have you been making payments your whole life under compulsion to do so because that birth certificate? Do you have the right of subrogation against the birth certificate? Does your right of equity have the right to be subrogated, to be subrogee of the COLB or birth certificate of live birth or birth certificate for the creditors of the certificate? Do you have priority, paramount, first, superior in order of time as subrogee? Brush up on these definitions. Redemption is a collateral security mortgage and or performance for contract. Surety. A surety is one who at the request of another and for the purposes of securing to himself benefit becomes responsible for the performance by the latter of some active in favor of the third person, or hypothecates property as surety, therefore, Civic Code, California. Suretyship. The contracts of suretyship is that whereby one obligates himself to pay the debts of another in consideration of credit or indulgence or other benefit given to his principal, the principal remaining bound thereof. It differs from a guarantee, i.e. this, that the consideration of the latter is a benefit flowing to the grantor. Georgia Code 1S82. Past consideration is really no consideration at all. Consideration must be something promised or performed now or in the future, but it cannot be something you did in the past. For example, instead of asking you to quit smoking, your rich uncle promises to give you $1,000 for helping him last year when he was moving. A couple of weeks go by, but your uncle does not give you the money. Unfortunately, there is not too much you can do because the promise to pay you in consideration for your good deed last year is a past consideration. So the agreement is unenforceable. 4 facts about consideration contract law requires you to know. Consideration. If they give you their guarantee, any guarantee is worth something. Can you sell it back to them? If you could, what what's the price you'd sell it back to them for? How about just stipulation to keep your account open going as per my stipulation? Subrogation. The substitution. The substitution of one thing for another, or of one person into the place of another with respects to rights, claims, or securities. Subrogation denotes the putting the third person who has paid a debt in the place of the creditor to whom has paid it, so as that he may exercise against the debtor all subrogation. 1117. Substantial damages. The right which the creditor, if unpaid, might have done. Brown. The equity by which a person who is secondarily liable for a debt and has paid it is put in the place of the creditor, so as to entitle to make use of all the securities and remedies possessed by the creditor, in order to enforce the right of exoneration as against the principal debtor, or of contribution against others who are liable in the same rank as himself. Legal subrogation. The term used where a person who doesn't own the debt pays it and then is entitled to remedies offered by the creditor. This term is the device that forces the person who owes the debt to pay it. Substitution. In the civil law, the putting one person in place of another, particularly that the act of a testator in naming a second devisee or legatee who is to take the bequest either on failure of the original devisee or legatee or after him. In Scotch law, the enumeration or designation of the heirs in the settlement of property substitutes in an entail are those heirs who are appointed in succession on failure of the others. Right of substitution, the ability to switch collateral with the same minimum value and marketability. Exoneration, to lift, remove the stain of being called out for blame, liability, or punishment. It is more that just freeing. It is more that just freeing an accused person of the responsibility for a criminal or otherwise illegal or wrongful act. It is publicly stating that this accused should never have been accused in the first place. Refer to acquit and exculpate. See exoneration, the removal of a burden, charge, or duty, particularly the act of relieving a person or estate from a charge or liability by casting the same upon another person or estate. Louisville and in R. Co. versus Com, C-O-M-M. 114 Kentucky 787 71 SW 916. Banner R. Burns, CC 39 Fed 898. A right or equity which exists between Black's Law Dictionary 2D, 2nd edition. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you soon.